you can publish a calendar feed. And then in Statical, it's just a little Rust program. It's a single executable. Everything's in there. Then it just pulls these calendar feeds. Or you can even have people email or bring it on a thumb drive, and it'll suck in these feeds, parses them, and then puts them all into one calendar.
Welcome to Static Feedback, the podcast all about static websites, brought to you by Cloud Cannon. Today I'm joined by Elio Greico, who is a very experienced software dev. He has a cybersecurity company, and he's doing a lot of thinking about what the future of the internet looks like. So excited to have him join us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So let's start off about talking about static sites. Like, what was your entry point into getting into static sites, and yeah, how has that developed over time?
Well, should probably keep this kind of brief, but my entry point was the 90s, right? When I started doing web design, that was it. There was no such thing as a dynamic website. Like, it was PHP, well, actually pre-PHP. It was just pages with server-side includes and CGI bin, and I was writing that by hand in Perl. And then later PHP came along and honestly is some ways better, but in some ways worse than Perl. So like that was it. There was just static websites, and I got to watch the web evolve. And as it's gotten more and more complicated, I mean, there's some nice stuff that happened, but there's some regressions too. Like most websites, it drives me insane. Most websites, it's like, here's some text. Text is still king on the web. I will always believe text. There's advantages. You can skim it. You can search it. There's a lot of stuff you could do with text that's really hard to do with video or audio. And so it's beautiful. Let's just stay with that. And you get these sites that I run a whole bunch of ad blockers and stuff because I'm just, my time is valuable. No, you don't get to yell at me from the side of my screen. That's just not happening. And so sites just, you load it and there's nothing there. There's not even a message saying, please, like some of the nicer sites are like, please turn on JavaScript, but mostly just nothing. And you load all of these JavaScript libraries only to have like 5 paragraphs of text and a few images. And you're like, dude, you could do this with just HTML. You don't even need CSS.
Yeah.
And there was a great article. I don't know if you ever see The Web is Doom?
No, I haven't.
And they plotted the bloat, going up on these websites. And this was like 5 or 6 years ago. The average size of a website, because of all this garbage they throw in there, is bigger than Doom 1.
Yeah. That tells the true story, doesn't it?
And that was a while ago. It's gotten worse. So that's insane, right? Like we are wasting so much compute and so much, like, people don't understand the full magnitude of how much we waste, right? They talk about Bitcoin being wasteful. And yes, Bitcoin is an insane extreme example that's orders and orders and orders of magnitude more wasteful than just about everything else in computing. But it's not the only thing. Like, we could shave a lot of efficiency off other services. So static sites are beautiful because they're back to the early internet. You have something very reliable. You have something very trustworthy. You don't have to worry about getting hacked or anything. They are fast as heck, right? The web has always been really, really good at serving static pages. There's just so many upsides. Why would you not do a static website? Like, if you're going to do an interactive video game or something, or a simulation, that's great. Throw some JavaScript in there. But even that, if it's local, you're still in a static website. So it's only when you want to build these big Facebook and Google styles, apps. Okay, fine. Now you have to go dynamic. But I would argue that a lot of those, right, there's better ways to do that stuff too. And we're seeing finally the cost of everyone using these big centralized services. And it is not a small cost.
Yeah, I think the majority of the web should be static websites, and it's not.
Totally agree.
And like, that's the question I'm kind of asking at the moment is how do we get there? Like, why aren't static sites more popular? Like, why do you think we've gone more heavily down that dynamic route?
I think there's 2 main reasons. Technology is much trendier. People like to say computer science engineering. In the most cases, that's false. It's not engineering. It's fashion, right? You look at like the proliferation of JavaScript libraries, and it's like, oh, which one is the cool new one? And it's not, wait a minute, let's understand which is better, because yes, better is a thing in computer science. You can look at the types of languages. There are 7 primary categories or languages. You can have, procedural, you can have functional, you can have probabilistic, right? There's all these totally separate types of languages that are each very well suited to different things. And depending on what you're doing, you might want Prolog way more than you want JavaScript. Um, but we don't choose it on that. We choose it based on what's trendy. So I think a lot of it is just whatever the search engine algorithm throws in your face, whatever school taught you.
Yeah.
That's a big part of it is just, hey, here, learn this. And then once you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Yeah, that's I think at any kind of web dev bootcamp, you're going to be thrown a particular tool set, and then that self perpetuates in the industry.
Yeah.
But it's
And
kind
the
of a
second
chicken.
thing,
It's like a
yeah,
chicken egg as well. It's
yeah.
like, are the businesses putting out React jobs, so the boot camps are like, okay, we need React, or is it vice
Oh,
versa? I think it's kind of connected, right?
I mean, React's great. If you have a big Facebook style web app, React is great. But if you're just putting a few paragraphs on a blog, no, no, just absolutely not. Like, don't, there's no need to load all that crap in there. And so the other thing that I would say is analytics, right? It's what's ruining the entire world is metrics fixation. And people want their analytics. And so a lot of times, like the dev teams that are working on, so I worked for Amazon over a decade ago, and we had all these different teams. It's like a federation of little startups, and each team has their own needs, and we all kind of cobble the site together based on our little thing. And so even on a much smaller website, you have the people designing the website, you have the designers, you have the accessibility people, you have the actual back end people, and then you have the people that want those marketing metrics, and they're like, hey, just throw like 50 JavaScript tracking libraries in there.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other reason you don't see static sites as much, is because people want those metrics.
Mm. So what was your journey from static websites in the 90s? Like, what's your kind of ideal stack that you're using now?
So I used to ask people that, and I've now changed it into two questions because it tells you a lot about someone as a dev. So if you were building a pragmatic project, like what would you use, or
Mm,
like what's your fantasy stack? Because there's two separate answers, right?
mm,
Because some people will lean toward fantasy, some people will lean toward pragmatism. So for static sites, right, like I use Supaw, which is Daniil Baturin. I think I'm saying his name right almost. But Supaw is amazing because unlike other static site generators, I tried Jekyll and it's just way too rigid. If you want to do the one thing, it's great, but you hit the wall pretty quick. And I found myself 3 days into like digging through Jekyll's internal so I could add a table of contents. And I'm like,
mm,
all right, clearly I am using the wrong SSG. So then I switched to Nanoc and Ruby, and then later
mm,
Middleman, which both of those are excellent, very extensible, but Middleman is just slightly cleaner than Nanoc. And then I tried Zola and Rust, and that was pretty cool. But again, started running into like the limits of what it can do. And then Supaw was just that blew my mind because it uses what is it? Not Beautiful Soup, Lambda Soup, which is based. The naming is kind of a joke on Beautiful Soup. So you take anything that can become HTML and you give it these transformer kind of instructions, and you can go really nuts in Lua. And you could say, take these chunks out of this HTML page and stick them over here, 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 and here
mm.
in the output page. So there's really not any limit to what you can do. So Supaw, it's so flexible. It's kind of like the Haskell of static site generators.
Interesting.
You could do whatever you want. You have to be able to you have to have some background to be able to learn it, to be able to take that type of power.
Yeah.
And like a static site generator chain like you guys are doing, like it's a great base because then you start with so much flexibility, and then you can augment on top of that and add more and more stuff. So there's just I love it. It's all the power I want, and there's no limits.
Interesting. So what's some of the like really, I guess, out there kind of things that you've done with Super?
Um, I haven't done anything too insane yet, but the main reason that it brought me to it was I wanted an auto-generated table of contents. I wanted one of the entire site, and I
Mm,
wanted one of, the actual headers in the markdown on the
mm,
page. And both of those are fairly trivial to do with Supaw. And instead of front matter, right? You can just actually tag and just say, use like micro formats and say, this little chunk here becomes the title of the page. And this little
uh,
chunk here becomes a, open graph description, and just slice and dice. And it's really neat because again, you can take anything you want as input. So you can use Markdown, you can use Haml, you can use Slim, you could use a Word document through Pandoc if it had
mm.
structure, convert that to HTML. Like you could take, if you were really insane, you could take images and use Tesseract to extract the text and turn that into pages. Like that would be a terrible idea, but you could do it. So it's really, it gives you full freedom to adjust your pages and kind of mangle them and turn them into whatever you want. But I haven't done any like crazy online demos and like Nikki Case style stuff. I haven't done anything like that. So sadly, I have no stories to share there.
Yeah, no, it sounds really interesting. Yeah, that kind of flexibility and the full power of anything to HTML. Yeah,
Yeah,
and the reuse on that just seems crazy.
just HTML modifying HTML the way the web was intended.
Yeah, so that's a good segue to static site chaining. So this is a term that hasn't really been pushed too much, but we're looking to push it more and more. Do you want to just give a bit of an overview of what this concept means?
Yeah, totally. And yes, I was wondering about that because I found 2 mentions on your website, and I was trying to find, like, where is the canonical place that I can link to in the Statical docs, and there I found the first blog post to mention it. I'm like, "Alright, I guess that's canonical, so put up a glossary, dude."
Yeah, it's
Um,
coming. It's coming. We got plans.
but it's static site chaining, for those who don't have a background in functional programming, it is a very, very functional programming-esque approach. Or if you're just familiar with the shell, it's very similar to that.
Yeah.
So the idea in functional programming, a lot of time you'll chain different things together. There's actually special operators in Haskell and Scala and OCaml that do pipe arrow or arrow pipe, and it makes it just visually beautiful. And you say this happens, then pass the result to this, then this, and this, kind of like you do pipes in the terminal. And to me, it's that same concept. You have an initial step that generates the base of the site, and you're like, oh, okay. We need a calendar. So then we're going to take that site and we're going to use SUPA, or excuse me, we're going to use Statical. After SUPA, Statical will run, and that'll pull in all the calendar data, and that'll inject some more pages into this subdirectory, and that'll give us the calendar. And then, well, it'd be really good if people could find things on the site with a really smart search engine. And oh, look, there's this really cool one called Page Find. So then we're going to take all that output and we're going to run that through Page Find, and then that'll give us this really nice search engine that's just really fast, really performant. And, it does all the word stemming, all the stuff you'd expect of a big, traditional dynamic search engine that you're paying money to run in the cloud. And it does it right in your browser, which is beautiful. And then after that, okay, well, the assets are still, we either want to prettify them or probably compress them down so they load faster. Like, it doesn't matter that much on a small site if you're wasting a few kilobytes. Right? Like at Amazon, right? If you're wasting a few kilobytes times billions of page
Yeah.
loads a day, that's a lot of transfer you're wasting. Like, you're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars minimum for that extra transfer. So just squeezing a kilobyte off Amazon's site makes a huge difference. So it's still considered best form to minimize. And I think Jampack is the preferred one. So then you run the whole site through Jampack. And I think that does images too, but you might want to
Mhm.
minimize or, automatically turn the images into multiple resolutions. And so, like, you go through all these steps and then you deploy. And it's such a beautiful functional idea. And none of these things even actually have to talk to each other or integrate. Supa doesn't need to know how PageFind works. And again, PageFind is just taking piles of HTML and just working with that. And so it's just, you have all of this flexibility to do whatever you want and get it done exactly how you want and use the best tool for the job. So it's like the anti, like if you go to Wix and Weebly and all those, you get completely locked in.
Mm.
Your site is now stuck in their thing. I mean, maybe you can export something, but what are you getting? Is there any way to take that collection of whatever the heck they give you and actually like import that into some other framework or some other site and keep your site and keep trivially updating it? Or do you have to start all over? And so with the static site generator chain, like, you could swap any piece and just,
Mm.
or add a new piece in there. Like, there's no penalty, there's no lock-in. It is extremely user first, like user centric and just freedom respecting. And so I love it. Like, we should all be doing this unless we need to do some insane, if you need some big fancy dynamic site where people are like real time communicating to each other. To answer the other question from what you asked earlier, just go with Elixir. Like, Phoenix is amazing. Anything on the Beam VM, whether it's Erlang, Gleam, Elixir, write your site in that, right? All of Amazon's stuff should be running on Beam. It's not, it's some weird mishmash of languages, but like, that's what you want for an actual dynamic site. Like, I think They had a single host with 2 million concurrent connections
Wow,
on a
that's
single host.
crazy.
Yeah. So
Insane.
anyway, but static site chains, like honestly, it's one of those things that when you see it, you're like, wait, how is this not already a thing? It's so
Yeah.
obvious. Like, why weren't we already doing this? Why did it take like again, thank you for you guys making it a thing. It should have been one sooner.
Yeah, agreed. Like it's an ecosystem I feel like we need to build with a bunch of tools that has this concept because rather than building a plugin specifically for Jekyll or Hugo
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever, you're building something that just takes HTML as an input and it'll work with all of the static site generators, even the ones that
Yeah.
can't have plugins. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
kind
I
of,
guess that's a big thing that's worth mentioning right there is page find. It'll work with anything. Like you don't have to like it doesn't have to fit and have a plugin with your generator. You can throw it on any site, which is just beautiful.
yeah, no, that's it. So before you mentioned Statical, so
Hmm,
let's talk a little bit about that. What's
okay.
Statical and why did you decide to create it?
Well, we had a great one of the guys I mentored in cybersecurity. So I got 25 years background in excuse me, programming, making different websites, EDA software, all kinds of junk. And then I got pulled into cybersecurity about the last 7 years, and I mentored one kid. He put up a calendar just using Talkify, which is it works. Um, and it was amazing because the entire Arizona cybersecurity community started looking at this site, and like people were scheduling conferences and they would pull up his site and be like, "Oh, they're okay. We were going to do, the third weekend in March, but there's another conference, so let's make it the fourth weekend, or let's just
Yeah,
bump it
yeah,
to next month." And it was such a good thing to keep the whole community running smoothly that I'm like, calendars are really powerful. And so we set up a new advanced cyber systems lab, which is azacsl.com. It's a little community resource if you want to come learn how to do all this stuff, and we wanted a calendar. And so initially we used it wasn't Talkify. I'm trying to remember the other one, and it just closed down too. So now we have to find a new thing anyway. And it's like I don't want to either embed a calendar that's connecting to some server with whatever kind of tracking somewhere, and then they got their stupid name on it, so it doesn't really integrate with the site. It doesn't look like it's part of the site because you could do that with Google, you could do that with some other services, or you can pay. And at the time, it's like $8 to $45 a month per calendar.
yeah.
And I'm like, I have 8 sites I want calendars on. That's a little like that's a fair amount of money on the low end and an insane amount of money. You know what kind of server I can buy for 45 times 8? Like I could set up a medium-sized business on that infrastructure. So yeah, like screw it, I'll build my own. And I wanted to learn Rust and like this is perfect. This is a great
Yeah.
bite-sized project that I can just learn in Rust.
S- So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about how it works, like as a user. Yeah, how would I use
So
Statical?
I'm trying to make this. I'm not going to go over too much of what's in the README, but I'm trying to target this at 3 groups. One, people who have basic command line knowledge, fire it up, run it, do a little config, run it, done. If you want to customize, it's all templatized, so you can really make sure it works with your site. And then the code is open source, permissive license. So if you want to like fork it, make a new version, contribute back, go for it. Um, so the key idea here, logins suck, right? Like it took me 10 minutes to get on with you because I tried to log in. They're doing OAuth, and for whatever reason, the first 2 Google accounts were like, nope, and it just some error. I'm like, okay, fine. So I had to use a different way of logging in, and so everyone has thousands of logins. Everyone chooses bad passwords. It's never going to work. I wrote a whole article on why passwords won't work. I don't want another one. And again, some of the guys in the security community, I mean, they are computer savvy because they're in cybersecurity, but like they're older, right? They're not going to have the tolerance like for another login. So I'm like, I don't want to write a dynamic site. I want calendars without login. So what it does is you can publish, whether you're talking Proton Mail, Gmail, or Google Calendar, whatever, you can publish a calendar feed. And then in Statical, it's just a little Rust program. It's a single executable. Everything's in there. And you can configure it. I added some commands trying to make it as friendly as possible, where you could say, give me a default config, and it'll spit out a default config with a whole bunch of comments in there. So you could see exactly what each thing does. And then you only need to do like 4 or 5 things. There's a ton of settings, but only 4 or 5. And then once you've done that, then it just pulls these calendar feeds. Or you can even have people email or bring it on a thumb drive, and it'll suck in these feeds, parses them, and then puts them all into one calendar. Now, in the future, I'm going to have some routing stuff in version 2 where you can say these 3 feeds go into this calendar, and then
Mm,
those feeds go into here, and then events from this one with these tags or these search patterns that match, like regexes, they go over here.
that's awesome.
And we're going to let you slice and dice and reorganize stuff in some really complex ways. And then we're also going to do some deduplication where when stuff comes in, if you have, again, I'm meaning this to be a community calendar. So we might have 6 to 12 to like 24 people all feeding into this calendar. Probably going to be some overlap where like 6 people are like Cactus Con is coming up in Arizona. It's our little mini DEF CON. So how do you take all of the information and fuse that together into a single event for Cactus Con rather than having 6 calendar events, which is just awful user experience? So these are some of the challenges. And this takes all this, creates some internal data structures, generates, I think it's 5 different views. We have a monthly view, a weekly view, we have a daily view, an event page, and we also have an agenda view that another gentleman added the first stab at and has been using on his site for like a year now, even when it was like early alpha. And also we generate, again, I have some more work to do here, but we generate our iCal feeds, because the other thing I want people to do is be able to subscribe, because a
Mm,
calendar subscription is just an ICS file
mm,
that you're pulling over HTTPS. So it works perfectly on a static site.
mm.
Yeah, just update whenever you update the site, it's up to date. Their little calendar program will go grab that and say, "Oh, look, new events." And so it perfectly integrates. So even if they never come to your website, they can still see all of the events that are there. So that's the gist of Statical. And again, there's no login. You use your existing calendar service, and you just, here's the public or the private or whatever URL you need. Here it is. And then it sucks all that in. And I even put in a little thing because Meetup was kind of pissing me off. I wanted to test it and pull in some calendar feeds from Meetup, and they don't let you pull calendar feeds without logging in. So I have not made this fully automatic, but I could. You could snag your auth cookies from Meetup, and it will basically log in on your behalf and pull those feeds that require authentication. And that should work fine on anything else. And there's actually some libraries in Rust where I could go dig through the browser cache on behalf of the user, because we're running locally. So there's no worry about like this going on some sketchy server. It's staying completely in your control, but we could dig through there, find the cookies automatically and pull those in. So at some point, if anyone asks, I might make it automatic. Right now, you have to go find the cookies in your browser cache and throw them in the config, and then it can just, basically impersonate you and grab the stuff and generate your calendars.
Yeah. No, that's incredible. What's really interesting about it is it's a fairly dynamic, like collaborative experience, like a group of people maintaining a calendar,
Yeah.
yet it's a static site. And
Yeah.
it's like a better solution than any of the individual calendar softwares.
I hope so. I mean, that I honestly hope it gives them, at a minimum, motivates them to fix their stuff, because I've been pretty unimpressed with most of the offerings, especially with the prices asked.
Yeah. Like I feel like a lot of people will just assume like if I'm paying for it or if it's like a service, it's gonna be better. And there's this notion
No.
against static websites of like art limited, but
Read Cory Doctorow and enshittification, right? No. If you're paying for it, at some point, I guarantee it'll get worse. You might get a good 5, maybe 10 years out of it if you're lucky. But any software as a service, any SaaS offering is going to enshittify in 5 to 10 years
mm,
if it doesn't outright close down.
mm,
So if you want to not have to keep updating and hopping services, like, just go open source, do static sites. You will be, at some point you will be let down.
yeah,
Best case.
yeah. And the beautiful thing about static sites is it's in your own Git repo. The Git repo is
Yeah.
probably, I think that should have a lifespan of more than 10 years, you would hope.
Yeah.
Depending on where you
That's a
host it.
separate conversation. I do want to throw one last thing in. One thing I'm really proud of, though. I wanted colors. So here's the problem. Colors are hard, right? Like, to really make colors look good, you need a lot of artistic background. You need to understand human perception. Like, colors are hard. You could spend decades and still have a lot to learn about colors. And so I wanted the colors on the calendar, right? I want to be able to have different events, different types of events and
Yeah.
feeds have different colors, but I don't want it to look like a kids show where there's just all these bright garish colors and then you choose yellow and you can't read the text because right, yellow perceptually looks way too bright. So I spent a lot of time thinking about how are we going to do colors? I don't want to do presets. I want full flexibility, choose any color you want, but I want it to look good. And I also want people to be able to make the colors more subdued or more intense depending on their needs. So there is this really cool thing. Have you seen OKLCH?
I have not.
Oh, this is so good. It's supported directly in CSS now, but we're doing the calculations in Statical, so it doesn't matter. We could spit out whatever color codes you want, use the old, hash format there, the old hex codes. So OKLCH is a perceptually adjusted color space. So instead of red, green, blue, or HSL, hue, saturation, and lightness, right? Because the problem is like yellow looks super bright with HSL and blue looks super dark. And then you get hue shift issues and all kinds of awful stuff. I'm not going to go over all the stuff from all the articles that I read. It took like 2 days to get this working and really dialed in. So what it does, OKLCH, there's also LCH UV, but they're fine. That's really good too. But OKLCH is lightness, chroma, and hue. And so when you give Statical a color, we can parse anything that's valid in CSS. So you can use just named colors and you can just say, make this calendar red and that one pink and this one orange and that one green and this other one yellow. And what it does, it pulls that in, it extracts the hue component because in design, the hue is what's the color. Like when you do a primary and a secondary in web design, you use the hue and you're allowed to saturate and desaturate and you're allowed to, change the lightness of it as much as you want, but the hue has to remain the same. And you should only have like 2 colors unless you're doing a kid site or you really understand color theory. And so we grab that primary color for each calendar, that hue, and then in the config, there's defaults, but there's a chroma value and a lightness value that are configurable. And so it will then swap out those values. Chrominance is like how intense is the color. So if you wanted a more subdued color scheme, just make it 0.1. If you want it way more intense, make it like 0.3 or 0.4. And again, like it works so well. If you have a dark theme site, bring the lightness way down. If you have a light site, bring it up. And you get colors because OKLCH is perceptually adjusted. All the colors look the same lightness. They all are equally readable. It's just beautiful.
Yeah,
so.
No, that's really interesting, and as you say, not something I'd thought about, but is very important for a calendar. Just being able to differentiate calendar, like different types of events,
Yeah.
kind of take that for granted.
And you don't have to know. Like I said, you could say yellow and it will still be readable. That's what's beautiful. You don't have to know any of that. I spent a little time, and the people who designed OKLCH, like they did all the work, so you benefit, which is how software should be.
Yeah, very cool. So if I want to use Statical, let's say on, well, just a static site, so I run the command line. What kind of control do I have over the templating and the layout of the page?
So there is a config file, and this should all be covered in the README. And to be clear, right now we're at 0.20 is the current version. This is still essentially alpha code. It's mostly feature complete for the really important stuff. But like right now, when you run it, it's going to just it's going to scroll in terminal. I need to take the debug output that I've been using to make sure everything's working properly. I need to adjust the settings and push like an 021 update where that goes into an actual log file or just doesn't get logged, depending on your settings. And then, yeah, I want to put a little nice progress bar so you can see, right? So anyway, it works, but it's still a little rough looking. I need to do some polishing. But you run it, you just put it in directory and you run it. And let me pull up I don't remember off the top of my head, Statical. And let me see. It has help. I've tried to make this as user-friendly as possible. And so it has create default config is the first thing you're going to want to run. And so the config file is embedded, like a default config is embedded into the program with comments. So when you say create default config, it will create that file. And then it says in the README, go modify like these 4 or 5 things, right? So there's not a lot you have to change. There's a ton of config, but you only have to actually change, and you can delete everything else from the file, but you do need to give it some calendars. So they have, a source like a file or a URL and the name of the calendar internally. And then there's like, I think a time zone that you need to set and what time zone are you rendering the calendar. And so you set the basic stuff and then you can run it. And that's it.
Oh.
Um, Now, if you want to customize it, um, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this. There's two other options: restore missing templates and restore missing assets. So if you don't want Statical, if you want it to look different, right, you can just customize. I think in the config, you can give it a different CSS path and say,
Mm.
just grab this CSS, throw it into the page so it can integrate really nicely with the rest of your website. But if you really want to get in there and customize, I think it's Terra templates, which are based off Jinja, which are similar to like Liquid and all those, and Mustache handlebars. And I use those. And so the templates are embedded in the program. But if you say restore templates, then it will, any templates you haven't overridden, it will just create the default ones that it's using, and you can just edit those. And
Mm.
the ones that you're not using, you can just delete,
Mm.
and it'll just fall back to the internal ones.
Nice.
And then again, if you're like, oh, shoot, I did want to customize that page, you just run restore again, and it will never delete the templates you already have there. That's why I call it restore rather than create. So it's always safe to rerun it, and it'll add back what's missing and then customize, delete the ones you don't care about customizing, and you're good to go. So you can completely redo
That's
the
awesome.
structure of the page.
Yeah. Yeah, very cool. Yeah,
Yeah.
so very easy to like integrate into a existing template
Yes.
or static site or
And the final feature in the config that I added is, so I want to integrate this into other sites. So I want to take a placeholder page, right? Because a lot of times with static sites, you'll have templates and then the content will get injected into that template. But because we're running this after the site generator has already run, you can make a placeholder page on your site that
mm,
has like no content. And I stole this idea from Daniel Baturin there with Supaw. And in the config, you could say, grab this file and inject the content here, and then you can tell it whether to delete that file or not. So even if you haven't made a placeholder page, I think you can actually take an existing page that's output. If I'm remembering right, if not, file a bug report. I'll fix it, get it working that way. But I'm pretty sure that's how it already works. But you could take a page and inject the calendar within the rest of your site without even modifying the templates.
that's perfect. I love
Yeah.
that.
So, so this is, again, it's pretty good for an alpha version. It just needs a little more polish, but it's already pretty usable. And I've tried to make it simple enough where it's obvious what needs to be done. And then because it's supposed to run in a static site generator chain, it doesn't automatically. I'm trying to remember. It may look for one config file in the local folder, but when you run it and you pass the paths on the command line, you pass the config files. And when I say files plural, you do it that way because you might want to run it for multiple sites depending on your setup. You might want to run it once for each site. So whatever, just make sure in that directory, call Statical, it'll find the config. I think it's statical.toml is the config file. And I think we could actually support YAML and other stuff too if we wanted. I think the library reads like 4 things.
Mm,
So it's really simple. Or if you're doing something, again, whatever, the key is flexibility. I want this to properly integrate into your workflow. So if you have 10 websites, you can just pass it wherever those are on your disk and just say, here are the 10 websites to generate right now. And it'll just go through and generate each website in turn. And all of the stuff, all of the paths that you specify in the config are relative to the config file.
mm.
So no matter where you run this from, it's not going to get confused. Like it knows, oh, okay, well, that's relative to here because we're running this config file. Now we're moving to the next one, and all these paths are relative to here now.
Got it. Yeah,
So
interesting. So that the calendar itself, does the library have an opinion on that? Like, as a visitor to the site, can I set my time zone and it will reflect the right time zone, or is that up to the web developer to implement that sort of thing?
so right now, it is static. It is completely static. It was really important to me. Here's an old man yells at cloud moment. I still believe in progressive enhancement.
Yeah.
Remember that golden age where it's like, we're going to make the site with just some raw HTML. Then we're going to throw some CSS at it to make it look pretty. And then we're going to throw some JavaScript, and
A
we're
little
just going to keep
a
adding.
sprinkling of JavaScript,
Yeah,
not a
yeah,
metric
not a
ton of.
deluge. Well, now we have the opposite, right? Just nothing. If you don't load the JavaScript, there's nothing there,
True.
which is just awful. Not even getting into the accessibility issues, which is just horrific for that. It's just annoying and disrespectful to the user. So I want this working as well as possible with no JavaScript.
Mm.
Because again, I work with people in cybersecurity, and a lot of them are at least as paranoid as me and just don't want to be running executable code, even though CSS technically CSS3 is Turing complete. So, but I want it as functional as possible. Now, there are some limitations, right? If we don't have JavaScript, we can't get the context of what is the user's time zone. So we're kind of stuck. If you set the time zone, your calendar is in your time zone. So, I mean, we could support multiple time zones, but right now we can only display whatever's set. In the future, I'd hope to add in version 2 or 3 some JavaScript as an option that either it'll be by default and you can disable it, or I haven't decided yet. But with that, the two things the JavaScript will give us is we can know what actual time it is. So we can draw stuff on the calendar showing, like, we can highlight the actual current day. Because right now the workaround is you could basically set it up on a cron job to run it once a day. So you always have the current day properly set up. But that's the only workaround right now. Without JavaScript, we can't say there's a current day or a selected day. With JavaScript, we could say, this is the selected day the user is interested in. And so then as we're moving, because this is a problem that I need to finish cleaning up. If I'm on a day and I click, show me the week for this day, well, that's easy. Just show me the week that day is contained by, or show me the month that day is contained by. But if I'm on the month view and I click toggle over to day view, which one? Right. So I've tried to make it kind of best guess and find hopefully the most sane day for it to jump to. But without JavaScript, like, I can't have it jump to today's day of the week or day of the month or anything else, or have a selected day. Like, that does all require JavaScript. So right now it does not do that. When I have time to get around to that, it will have all that functionality once I add the JavaScript on top of it.
Very cool. Yeah, I was just trying to think of, like, I want to go make some calendars and try it out. But like,
yeah, please do, and file bug reports if anything doesn't work.
I would love to. I'm going to. But the two uses cases that came to mind for me was one, like a conference. It'd be awesome. Just like, you only need a day view for that. But let's say it's an 8-hour conference and you have half-hour blocks of talks. Just being able to manage that in whatever calendar software I want, embed it on a website. And then maybe me as the web developer, or eventually it'd be awesome if the library itself could do it. Like, it's tracking, like, we're up to this talk, this is now, and it's in your time zone. Like, being able to just embed that in a site and manage it through my calendar software would be pretty amazing.
The one part where that gets real tricky is, like, you're talking about it going from thing to thing. That's easy, right? And I'll say, anytime, because I've written date time software multiple points in my career, it's always a bad time. Whatever you're doing, whatever you think, you're like, okay, I got everything handled. Wrong. You missed something. It's going to screw you up. Like, there's always something to bite you in the butt 100% of the time. Gets really bad if you do distributed systems, because then, like, it's physically impossible to sync stuff to, like, sub-millisecond time over large distances because of Einstein's theory of relativity. So then you're just like, the universe hates you as a programmer. Like, welcome. But yeah, fortunately, that's not what we're talking about. But the problem is, like, once I had JavaScript, if I let the user set their own time zone for display, how do I handle events that are borderline? So if that event got truncated to the past day, depending on the time zone you set, maybe it's actually in your day.
Yeah.
So we actually have to do some really crazy stuff when we do JavaScript. If we let the user change display time zones, we actually have to, like, load as data into the page extra events. We have to look, what's our worst case scenario if the user's on this one time zone and they could go all the way to the other side here. all the possible events that should have to show up have to be hidden in the page in like a JavaScript data structure in like a JSON blob or something, so that we can, as they adjust that, redraw the calendar using JavaScript with those events. So they're now in the place they should be. So events aren't missing.
Yeah,
So
no,
I'm not looking forward to that.
it's a can of
So,
worms. Like the other one I thought of then is you've got, I mean, most time zones are either on the half hour or the hour, which is nice for event blocks. But
not
there's,
all of them.
yeah. So now you've got the conference start at 9:15, and that
Yeah.
adds like the UI has to change.
But the one thing I do want to do is like you're talking about conferences. Yeah, like I've thought of this. So I've when I do conferences, like when I'm attending stuff beforehand, I'll go put placeholders for like the entirety of the event, right? But then I'll go find the talks I'm really interested in and put those talks specifically and any location I need, like what room it's in, what building it's in, et cetera. So I can go find them real easily. And so I want that to be a thing that Statical supports. So if you're doing a conference, you can have just a general conference placeholder calendar feed. Or if the conference has 3 tracks, you can have a track 1
Yeah,
feed, a track 2 feed, a track 3 feed. And so you can decide which events you want to subscribe to, and you can add those so you see the actual detailed track of like, here's all the talks that are happening and where they are.
yeah. No, that would be incredible. Yeah, and again, it's like without static cal, how do I solve this now? It's like, okay, I'm sure Meetup has some embed that does that, that has a bunch of tracking. It probably costs a bunch and has their logo plastered over it. Like it's
Yeah.
hard to think of something that would be so easy and so like such a generic solution in terms of what software I get to use to manage it. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And I'm hoping someone throws a visual thing on. I don't know if I'll get to that ever, but that now the future, what I'd like to see, I'd love to see auto scheduling, but we can't do that with static. We can maybe do parts of it, and I have thoughts there, but I have an idea in my mind for if we redid the internet, how could you do calendar scheduling? So the problem with calendar scheduling, if you're all on one server and it knows all of everyone's events, it's really easy to schedule stuff. The algorithms aren't complicated. The problem is, what if I'm using my server and you have your company's server, and I don't want you to know all of my availability,
Mm.
right? And you don't want me to know all of your availability. How do we then schedule? And so I haven't modeled it in TLA plus. I think this would be a great use for that, to see like, does the algorithm actually work? Are there any places where it just doesn't work at all? And how do we deal with that? But could we do a bidding thing where in the future, if we had agents kind
Interesting.
of, hey, here's 3 times that work for me. Does your agent, are you okay with these, or do you want to counter offer me 3 times? And so could we do this bidding process and actually automatically schedule where it's just like, hey man, let's have a meeting whenever you're available. And you're like, okay. And we just both click yes. And an agent running on my device and on your device take care of all this negotiation. And the amount of, scheduling info they've exposed to each other is very minimal.
Mm.
So we're maintaining good privacy and security with auto scheduling with anyone using this protocol. That's the fantasy. Someday I might build that, or at least attempt it.
Yeah. No, that's interesting. Yeah. Is that how you see the the internet heading to more decentralized kind of solutions like that?
So, um, oh, so many thoughts here. We could go for hours. I'll try to keep this very brief since we're already coming up on. So I've been to several of the DWeb conferences, the Decentralized Web Summit that Brewster Kahle and Winnie Hanamura and the Internet Archive have been doing for a few years now. And there's some really good people there. Those are worth going to. Rebooting the Web of Trust with Chris Allen, amazing identity stuff, like, self-issued digital identity. But I've been thinking about this stuff since like 1999 when the Publius project, I forget which university that was out of, but I read about this censorship resistant network. And then I watched Ian Clark build Freenet, which is now Hyphenet. And I've watched all these things, and BitTorrent, remember that took over the internet, where like 60% of global traffic was BitTorrent.
Mm,
And it was only when all the ISPs and the music labels and the record labels and the movie industry spent millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to try to kill BitTorrent. And it worked, sadly, because it's a really good protocol. But that's what I want. Like, I don't want to go have to pay Wix or anyone to host a site. And then if they change the terms of service or they just go out of business, which happens fairly frequently with some of these large tech companies, it's gone. And did I archive it? Like, do I want to take the time to put it back up? Like, I love Freenet. You publish a free site and it's just there. Now, the problem is it's not there forever because Freenet has such an insane threat model. Like, you're Julian Assange and you're fighting global powers that have infinite resource, right? So it's not as easy as it should be to use because that's the threat model. So I would love to see something that takes a step back from this insane threat model of every government is out to get me and just like, hey, I'm a normal person. I just don't want to have to think about where my data is. I want to publish it. I don't want to have to pay a whole bunch of money every month. I just want to share this with any other friends that want this data. And it's such a great model for that, right? It's like a little static site in a Git repo. And you just sync that with other people's computers and that's it. And everyone has their
Mm,
own little local copy of the site and they just have it. And the only thing you need the internet for is to get new changes, see what's changed, and the rest of the time you have all the data locally, so you'll never lose that data. You're guaranteed to have that data forever. So like if you share pictures, right? If you take pictures during the holiday and you share them with the grandparents of the kid, right? That's not going to disappear. They're not going to lose their login. They will now have their copy of those pictures as long as they want, and Zuckerberg's not digging through them, seeing how he can like train new facial recognition models and all the sketchy shit that all the data brokers do. Like, it's such a beautiful model. I see static websites as kind of a step, a necessary step toward a fully distributed version of the internet that is so much better for
mm,
privacy, so much more reliable. Data doesn't just wink out of existence left and right. It's there as long as you want it to be there.
mm.
Like, that's what I see as the future. And what else can we build on it?
Yeah,
So
it's interesting. It like really leans into the kind of atomic nature of a static site where it's
yeah.
like it's that's it. It's in this tiny, well, depending on how big the site is, it's in a box, and you can take that box and host it on whatever web server you want. Um,
Or not even host it. Like I said, just do synchronization.
yeah, that's interesting, eh? So that the protocol would would it connect directly to the Git repo or yeah, how?
So Git, for instance, and
Mm,
I don't know if Git is there's some issues actually when you talk about video and stuff, there's some issues using Git, but
mm,
because Git handles really small files really well, but it doesn't do great with large
yeah,
files. Um, but there's other data structures. So we're looking at what is the most appropriate, or is it a hybrid approach? But all you really need to do is synchronize state. Right? So Git is very, very amenable to saying, oh, like it's based off a Merkle tree. So you can quickly say, oh, these are the parts of this tree that are missing. So go ahead and I can actually, like, I wrote a thing way, way back. I did wrote a proof of concept that I need to rewrite in Rust that take a Git repo, ask another Git repo what its heads are, figure out where the overlap is, figure out what's missing, and then even in a swarm fashion, do this with like 10 different hosts at a time and figure out which ones, like which commits are the rarest. Like, oh, that host is the only one that has these new commits. So I'm going to ask for those 10 from over there. And then I'm going to ask this other host that has those plus a few more. And
yeah.
just you go for the rarest first and you do a swarm download. So, like, you can have Git doing swarm downloads. It's beautiful. And that way you're
Oh,
not asking any one person. You're not like, give me all the data. And it's like some huge request just
it's kind of like
saturating their.
BitTorrent, like
Yeah.
similar
Yeah,
protocol
and people
or
have
ideas.
done Git torrent. Someone actually did that
Oh,
project.
wow.
Like, there's a lot of interesting research in the space that, it'll be interesting to see where it ends up, and I'm talking with 2 guys right now that have written their own versions, as have I. So, the tricky bit is, can you make like, the computer science is really cool, but can you make it easy enough to use
Yeah.
where normal people can get the benefits of these systems, and it's as easy or easier than like logging into Facebook because Facebook's awful, but people have figured out how to get in there. So that has to be your target is better than Facebook usability wise.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like I feel like torrenting got there where
Yeah. Oh
the,
yeah.
like you didn't need to understand the protocol at all. You just knew, okay, I can
Yeah.
search and I can click download and it's going to connect to people and download this thing.
Such a beautiful protocol, right? Tit for tat, where it's like, cool, you give me this, and so I'll give you some other data so no one's leeching. So everything's easy to find. Like, oh, and again, the more popular it is, the more available it is. You don't have to worry
Yeah.
about load balancing or like
Yeah.
spikes in billing because suddenly a whole bunch of people want to see like, slash dotted back in the day or Hacker News, and suddenly like 100,000 people all want to see your site right now.
Yeah,
So
it's like
that's
spread over the whole network, isn't it? So one host isn't really being hit too hard at
every
all.
person that downloads it gets they become a source, which by the way, named-data.net, Van Jacobson has actually pushed that concept up from layer 7 down to like layer 3 or 4.
Mm.
Like we could have the entire internet behaving that way if I mean, it's supposed to sit on IPv6. So someday, whenever we've all adopted IPv6, we can move to named data and the entire internet can be that.
Very interesting. I feel like that's a good note to finish on. That would be a very exciting future. Yeah, I'm glad that you're working on that. I'm keen to watch progress
Thank
and
you.
yeah. So, Elio, thank you so much for coming on today. If people are interested in contributing or learning about Statical, how can they get involved?
Well, look it up on GitHub. That's popular, so I have the repo up there. My website, I kind of have a personal routing website. I don't know if I put up any contact info on there. Like I said, I'm still kind of doing the security thing, so I try to stay not super accessible. But my website is just my name. It's just eliogreico.com. And that has like all of my other projects and other websites that I'm working on. So I will be putting up some screenshots for a whole bunch of stuff and actually show off what do the calendars look like coming out of
Yeah.
Statical. So yeah, I would say I'm trying to think if I want to give give an email address. That's always been a sketchy thing.
No, I think
Um,
the GitHub's enough. I think you can, they can
yeah,
file an issue on
Yeah,
GitHub.
reach out to me through GitHub. That seems like the safest way if you're interested in Statical. And I'm happy if someone wants to help work on this and they know Rust. Definitely happy to take contributors. One guy's already helped out. He added the agenda view initially, and then I did a whole bunch of work refactoring and adding some functionality. But yeah, it's like I said, it's out there. Like, let's make it. I would love to see this become like the calendaring standard. And you can count on this, right? You can grab all of the code. You never have to worry about the rug being pulled out from under you and like, crap, my calendar service went out.
Yeah.
Nope, not never a problem.
That's it. And if your calendar service goes out, like Google Cal or whatever, you can swap it out for another one and it will keep working.
Yeah. It's a beautiful thing.
Nice. Thanks again, Elio.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode. You can find more at YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.